Hey everyone, welcome back to more HOA stories. Picture this. You wake up one morning only to discover your brand new Tesla being hauled out of your very own driveway. The reason? The newly elected Homeowner Association president has decided that electric vehicles are suddenly prohibited. She gave me an ultimatum: sell my car within 30 days or face daily fines that could financially ruin me. Let's get right into it. The main story kicks off like this. The neighborhood I live in has an HOA. Before committing to join, I did my homework on what I'd be signing up for. I've come across way too many HOA nightmare stories, and the last thing I wanted was to end up as another cautionary tale. Despite my best efforts, though, it seems I kind of did anyway. Luckily, this particular HOA had overwhelmingly positive reviews, and in practice, they genuinely backed that up. This HOA has been nothing but kind, helpful, and consistently effective, said no one ever. Whenever an issue pops up in the neighborhood, whether it's a conflict between residents or a maintenance concern, they handle it promptly. The HOA operates with a board, and every 2 years they run elections to rotate members in and out. This year marked the end of the previous board's term, so new members were voted in. The incoming president was a woman we'll refer to as Karen. I had never personally interacted with Karen. All I knew was that she was reasonably well off. Not extraordinarily wealthy by any means, but noticeably more so than the rest of the residents, and that she lived a few streets away. Because of the distance, I rarely crossed paths with her. I'd spot her occasionally on a neighborhood stroll, but that was pretty much the extent of it. Now, as you've gathered from the title, I own a Tesla. I chose to go electric because I wanted to do my small part in a much larger picture. I'm just one piece of a very big puzzle, but every piece matters, right? That's what drove my decision. I live alone, so I typically park in my own driveway to free up space on the street. Our street isn't ridiculously narrow or anything, but once cars start lining up on both sides, it can feel a bit cramped. In the 5 years I've been living there, I hadn't broken a single HOA rule, not one. When you become a member, they either email you the guidelines or mail you a physical copy upon request. Like any contract, whenever rules are updated or added, they send out a notification along with a link to the updated guidelines on their website, so everyone stays informed. The car-related rules are fairly limited. No excessively loud vehicles, no blasting music through your car speakers, no reckless driving, and so on. Pretty standard road safety and common courtesy type stuff. My city also requires overnight parked vehicles to display a permit. So another rule is that unregistered cars are subject to towing. Of course, I was well aware of all this and had a valid permit for my Tesla. So you can only imagine how floored I was to step outside one morning and find my Tesla being towed away. As both good and bad timing would have it, I was just about to leave for work when the tow truck showed up, so I caught the whole thing before my car was gone. Standing there on the street, overseeing everything, was Karen. I walked up and asked her why my car was being removed. Karen told me that electric vehicles were in violation of one of the HOA bylaws and therefore had to be towed. I told her I hadn't received any notice about this, and she scoffed, saying it was obvious I didn't care about the community. Otherwise, I would have been keeping up with updates and would have known a vehicle like mine wasn't permitted. I was completely thrown off by both her rudeness and by this supposed bylaw I'd never heard of. I asked her how she expected me to get to work without my car, and she simply shrugged, saying it wasn't her concern. I didn't have time to keep arguing because now I had to figure out how to get to the office. I shot my boss a quick text, letting him know I might be running late since my car had been unexpectedly towed. And honestly, any reasonable boss should be understanding in that scenario. That's clearly the kind of thing that can only happen when you live in an HOA neighborhood. Fortunately, he's a pretty laid-back guy and wasn't going to hold it against me, even though technically the situation could have been considered my fault. I ended up booking an Uber to work, which was a frustrating and expensive ride. On the bright side, the towing company keeps their office open pretty much around the clock, so after work I headed straight there to sort things out. I asked them if there was any reason my car had been towed beyond what Karen had told me. They said they didn't have any additional information and that the reason Karen gave me was the same one she'd given them. They were surprisingly cooperative, probably because they too didn't really understand the legitimate basis for the tow. and ended up releasing my car after I paid a fee. But it didn't end there. The moment Karen noticed I had my car back, she ramped up her hostility. First, she fired off an email to the entire community declaring that electric vehicles were banned from the neighborhood and that any resident with one would be in violation of the guidelines. Most people in this neighborhood are middle-aged or older, so they're not particularly enthusiastic about electric cars. They largely drive gas-powered vehicles, which is understandable. Gas stations are still far more widespread than charging stations. I was essentially the only person with an electric vehicle, and I was starting to suspect this was less about any policy and more of a targeted campaign against me personally. On top of all that, she started sending me warnings. Nothing threatening in a physical sense, nothing extreme, but warnings nonetheless. She began mailing me letters stating that I had 30 days to get rid of my car and arrange alternative transportation. Incredibly generous of her, right? Before she'd start issuing daily fines for simply having my car. I disregarded those letters, but she was as good as her word. The moment that 1 month mark passed, the fines started rolling in. That's when I really began to worry. I didn't want to pay up because I needed my car. I wasn't in a position to drop thousands on a new one out of nowhere, especially after everything I put into getting this one. And besides, this felt like a completely ridiculous rule that Karen had essentially invented on her own. There had been zero warning. She just had my car towed like it was nothing. At the same time, Karen held the president's title, and I was hesitant to push back too hard in case it made things worse. What if it somehow turned out to be a legitimate policy, and I'd end up on the hook for both a new car and all the fines? And if I refused to pay, those fines would just keep stacking up. Either way, it was a lousy position to be in. In the end, I decided to bring the matter to the HOA directly. And by the way, if you were in this situation and a clearly unhinged HOA Karen president had your car towed for essentially no valid reason and started fabricating rules and fines, what would you do? Also, let me know where in the world you're watching from today. And please don't forget to hit like on the video. It genuinely helps me go up against the YouTube algorithm. Even if this had been a legitimate rule, the way it was being carried out was aggressive and completely unreasonable. Expecting me to upend my whole routine over a policy that appeared with zero notice was absurd. I went onto the HOA website, which has a suggestions form that lets members flag concerns without having to wait until the next general meeting. I hadn't been on the site in a while, since the rules hadn't changed recently, and I'd had no other reason to check in. So I had to poke around a bit before I found it. The website had actually been updated since my last visit, though, and I stumbled onto something that would prove far more useful than the suggestions form. On the HOA's About page, they outlined their core values and guiding principles. The usual language about fostering a welcoming community was all there, but they also specifically highlighted eco-friendliness and green initiatives. Out of curiosity, I pulled up Karen's Facebook page to try to understand what her beef with electric cars actually was. If this wasn't an HOA-wide position, why was she so dead set on eliminating electric vehicles? It didn't take long to piece it together. Based on Karen's posts and shares, she was a firm believer that climate change is a hoax. She hated electric cars for the sound they make, and because she finds them ugly. That was literally it. All of this upheaval simply because she personally finds electric cars irritating and unattractive. With that information in hand, I decided to take the matter directly to the Homeowners Association and to Karen herself. I waited for the next general meeting, figuring that public accountability would work in my favor. The general meetings tend to be brief. The HOA board gives updates, opens the floor for comments or suggestions, then wraps up. When the floor was opened, I stepped forward. Karen clearly didn't want me to speak, but she had no authority to silence me, so I was given the floor. I opened by saying that I had been very satisfied with the HOA and the work they were doing, including the commitment to eco-friendliness and green initiatives highlighted on their website. Then I said that I wasn't entirely convinced the HOA truly stood behind those initiatives if they were simultaneously implementing policies that penalized residents for driving electric vehicles. Karen then tried to cut me off, calling what I was saying nonsense. But that only drew the attention of the other board members, who wanted to know more. I laid out the whole story, how Karen had ordered my car towed, how she had sent a mass email declaring electric vehicles banned in the neighborhood, sent from her personal email, which is why the board hadn't seen it, and how I was being hit with daily fines. I didn't even frame it as something Karen had done personally. I just presented the facts. I also brought up that Karen didn't believe in climate change and suggested they either ask her directly or check her Facebook page if she wasn't forthcoming. I then asked them how the HOA could credibly champion environmental responsibility with a president who denied climate change. The board was visibly taken aback. They reiterated that their environmental stance remained firm and that no rule banning electric vehicles had ever been approved by the board. The meeting was cut short and the board members stepped away, presumably to confer privately. Everyone in attendance was stunned, buzzing with conversation afterward. People do love a good scandal. Within a week, following an emergency board meeting and a formal vote, the HOA released an official statement announcing that Karen had been removed from the board for acting without authorization and for demonstrating clear misalignment with the board's values and direction. Karen was replaced by a temporary stand-in while a brief election was held to find a proper replacement. The HOA issued a sincere apology to me and reimbursed me for both the towing fine and the Uber I had been forced to pay, something I was genuinely grateful for. They also put out an announcement affirming that electric vehicles were not only permitted but actively encouraged, citing their environmental benefits. All things considered, the outcome was better than I had dared to hope. I didn't have to pay a single one of those ridiculous fines. I got my money back, and Karen, who had been abusing her authority, was voted off the board. And honestly, guys, I have to say that was a surprisingly decent HOA. Then again, not every HOA is a complete disaster. The next one is a malicious compliance story titled, "You said to put your crap outside. You never said where." So this happened roughly 10 years ago, but still makes me laugh every time it crosses my mind. I was in my early 20s, dating this guy who was outrageously controlling and completely full of himself, a textbook narcissist. Everything in his world revolved around him, and as far as he was concerned, he was incapable of doing wrong. You know the type. Anyway, after I caught him cheating, I finally reached my breaking point and told him we were done for good. The way I found out is honestly the best part. I'd had my suspicions for a while, so I went through his phone. Sure enough, there were months' worth of messages between him and some woman he worked with. Flirty nonsense. Talk about how he couldn't wait to leave me. All that garbage. But one particular message had me rolling my eyes. He had sent her this the day before. "She's driving me crazy. She's got me through the roof. I need you so bad, babe. Got me through the roof." Pretty sure that's not how the expression works. Your blood pressure can be through the roof, sure. Your anxiety, your rage, fine. But unless you're Spider-Man or some haunted Victorian child, you are not through the roof. The next morning, while he was at work, I texted him and said I was done. He kept pushing me to explain myself, but I never let on that I'd read his messages. I let him sit in his own arrogance until it finally dawned on him that I wasn't bluffing. By that point, he had essentially moved into my house, so naturally he wanted all his belongings back. He texted me something along the lines of, "You better have all my crap outside when I get there. Every bit of it. I'm not making 2 trips. Oh, don't worry, sweetheart." I gathered every last item he had at my place, at least a third of his wardrobe, a stack of overpriced hats, 2 pairs of pristine Jordans, and an iPad. I stuffed everything except the iPad into a trash bag, tied it loosely, walked outside, and hurled it straight onto the roof. Some of his clothes burst out midair and scattered across the yard. Most of it landed on the roof and just sat there like it had paid rent. As for the iPad, I placed it in a box and left it near the edge of the driveway. Not long after, a couple of teenagers wandered by and peeked inside. I was sitting on the porch when one of them asked, "Is this yours?" "Nope. Can we have it?" "Sure, why not?" He told me to put his stuff outside. He never said anything about me having to stand guard over it. About 2 hours later, he pulled up, saw his clothes scattered across the lawn and a trash bag hanging off the roof, and completely lost it. He started hammering on the door, furious, demanding to know why his clothes were on the roof. I swung the door open, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Well, based on the text you sent your little girlfriend, apparently I had you through the roof." I figured your clothes might as well join you. And you did tell me to put your crap outside. You just never specified where. He stood there red-faced, fists clenched, absolutely seething. How the hell am I supposed to get my stuff off the roof? I shrugged, smiled sweetly, and said, maybe your girlfriend can lend you a ladder. Then I slammed the door in his face. The funniest part? He ended up making 2 trips after all. He did come back later with a ladder. Whether she lent it to him or not, I have no idea. I stayed inside with the door locked and didn't hear much from him after that. ETA. The one and only time I spoke to him following the breakup was the next day, when he texted asking if he could come pick up his iPad. I told him the truth. I'd put it outside just like he'd asked. If it wasn't there anymore, someone must have taken it. Sorry about that. I don't think he believed me because he threatened to track it with GPS. I told him to go right ahead. Whether he ever managed to locate it, I honestly couldn't say. I blocked his number after that. The next one is another great malicious compliance story, titled Under Supervised. And by the way, let me know in the comments whether you're enjoying the malicious compliance stories. I've been featuring more of them lately, and I really get a kick out of them. Back when I was working at an FAA facility doing repair and overhaul, we had a boss who wanted his hands in absolutely everything. This boss had come over from the production side and couldn't wrap his head around why our work was reactive rather than scheduled, the way production is. Repair and overhaul is exactly what it sounds like. We fix or refurbish components that come back from the field. You can't schedule it any more than the customer can predict when something breaks and sends it in. Not really the point of the story, but it gives you some context for the mindset at play. About a month after this boss arrived, we had a customer representative on site discussing a product I was working on with the engineering team. The customer had a question about a specific recurring failure and wanted to speak with the technician, meaning me. So the engineer brought the customer rep over and I answered their question. Simple enough, right? Wrong. The boss decided I hadn't had the authority to respond and that the customer should have been directed to him or to quality assurance, QA. At the next morning stand-up, the boss reiterated to the entire team that no one was to speak with anyone outside the company unless either the boss or QA was present for the conversation. I asked for that in writing and had an email in my inbox within minutes of the stand-up wrapping up. Fast forward about a month. I've been sticking strictly to the directive, not speaking to anyone outside the company without the boss or QA present. When we had an ISO 9001 audit, the audit was scheduled in advance, and somehow, when the auditor made their way onto the repair floor, I was the only one around. So naturally, I was the one who got audited. Simple enough, right? The auditor asked me what I was working on. I replied that I wasn't permitted to speak with personnel from outside the company without my boss or QA present. The auditor asked whether I knew who they were. And yes, I did. They had introduced themselves when they approached me. I let them know I had been given specific instructions and was not in a position to continue the conversation. They asked if I could show them those instructions. As soon as I learned I was going to be audited, I'd sent the email to the printer. I asked the auditor to give me just 1 minute, retrieved the email, and handed it over. The auditor thanked me and left. The next morning at stand-up, the boss walked in alongside regional management. He apologized to the team and announced that, going forward, technicians were permitted to speak with people from outside the company without the boss or QA being present. I raised my hand. The boss told me the updated email had already been sent out. I later found out through the grapevine that the boss had been placed on a PIP, a personal improvement program, as a result. And now for the finale, we have a pro-revenge story from our very own subreddit, r/ripe stories, titled Pro Revenge Against School Bullies. And just a reminder, if you'd like to share your own stories, you can send them to my email at ripereddit@gmail.com or post them directly on our /ripe stories on Reddit, where there's a solid chance I'll feature them in a video. This one was submitted by user hotmatch966. This goes back over 25 years, but it remains one of my most treasured victories over the people who made my school life miserable from year 1 all the way through year 12. I was always the short, overweight girl at school, being raised by a single mom alongside my older brother in a neighborhood that was increasingly becoming wealthy and elite. In the early years, I had a speech impediment that made me sound quite a bit like Elmer Fudd. By the time I'd overcome that, I was officially a teenager and had discovered the wonderful world of sarcasm. It helped ease the bullying, but it never eliminated it entirely. That changed in my last 3 years of school, when I enrolled in an elective class that covered various forms of public speaking. All of the formats were interesting, but the one I fell completely in love with was the detailed 8-minute speech with visual aids. The moment I realized the class was scheduled right after lunch, I broke into an evil grin that would have made the Grinch look like a Care Bear. I knew I couldn't go all in with my very first speech, though. I was playing the long game, planning to take the class across years 10, 11, and 12. In year 10, I did a deep dive into Vlad Tempest, also known as Vlad Dracul, also known as Vlad the Impaler, one of the historical figures Bram Stoker drew on for inspiration when creating Dracula. I compiled a short list of his most dastardly, most depraved, most thoroughly repugnant acts and shaped them into a neat little speech. By the time I finished delivering it, my barely contained enthusiasm for the subject matter was enough to make some of the bullies genuinely uneasy around me. A solid opening move. Year 11 arrived, and I had been plotting that year speech ever since I'd wrapped up the last one. The topic, 13th century weapons of war and their effects on the human body. The crowning touch was that I was actually permitted to bring a one-handed battle axe to school on the day of my presentation. Let me tell you, the moment I pulled that thing out from behind the poster boards holding my hand-drawn visual aids, every single person who had witnessed the Vlad the Impaler speech immediately began pushing their desks away from me. The sheer irrational panic in their eyes gave me a level of malicious satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. Then it was time to plan for year 12. The summer came and went, and I had spent the whole break researching what would become my most celebrated achievement. By that point, the teacher had figured out exactly what I was up to and found the whole thing genuinely entertaining. So what would never be approved as a topic in today's world got the green light. Medieval torture devices and their effects on the human body. Remember how I mentioned the class was right after lunch? As my speech progressed, more and more classmates began quietly excusing themselves from the room, looking as green as humanly possible. By the time I finished, the only person remaining in the classroom was the teacher. I had cost 27 classmates their lunches. For the rest of that school year, not a single bully came near me. I graduated on June 5th, 1998, and to this day, I'm still remembered as the girl who cleared an entire classroom in 8 minutes flat with nothing but a speech. And yes, my mom was strangely proud. And the final story comes from our /petty revenge, titled Dress Down. So here's what happened. I worked in an office where management promoted a brand new, completely inexperienced, and unqualified yes man from an entry-level position straight up to team lead, one of 3 beneath the manager, overseeing a team of roughly 30 people. HR's own rules stated he wasn't even eligible to apply, having been with the company less than a year and having 0 leadership experience. Grievances were filed with HR and then quietly dropped, despite multiple fully qualified candidates with spotless records being in the running. He was well known as a sycophant and wasn't particularly well-liked before the promotion. After it, he was flat-out despised, with the exception of a few obvious favorites, naturally. Looking back, it's almost entertaining how far people will lower themselves for the tiniest taste of authority. Anyway, middle management was aware that he was universally loathed and told him he needed to find a way to win people over. His solution, not required, but you should think of them as required monthly happy hours. For the first one, most people felt pressured to show up and started rearranging their lives to make it work. Some had an hour's commute each way and were scrambling to arrange babysitters. These people genuinely feared for their jobs if they skipped out on having a few beers with the boss. Worth noting, he had somehow roped in everyone under the manager, and I wasn't even technically under his supervision. I knew my rights and declined the invitation. He stopped by my cubicle a few times that day, tried to pressure me into coming. I told him plainly, there's no way I'm giving up my personal time for work socializing. Either keep me on the clock or don't ask me to be there. I know my rights. I got along fine with my teammates, had been to parties at their homes and everything, but going out with this particular team lead was simply not happening. He didn't appreciate that and walked off in a huff. The next day, Everyone came in putting on a show of having had a great time, though it was painfully obvious they were just trying to shake off the team lead's clumsy attempts at bonding. Around 10 o'clock, we had a stand-up, and he spent part of it talking about what a wonderful time everyone had. Then he singled me out, called me antisocial, implied that management notices when people aren't team players, and made it clear that skipping required events wasn't a good look. All right, noted. About 20 minutes later, I sent an email to the entire team. Hey all, a team member asked me about required after-work events that are unpaid, so I thought I'd share this with everyone. State statute. Reference specifies that for hourly employees like us, attendance at these kinds of events cannot be mandated without us being compensated for our time. So if you can't find a sitter or just can't make it, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. Totally friendly. Totally non confrontacional. Totally effective. The team lead sat alone at the bar for the next 2 required but not really required happy hours and had to go find some other way to make people pretend to like him. And yeah, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.